Hi readers, welcome back to Reads with Rune B. We are going to continue with Alice. We've only got 2 chapters left. So I'm going to read Who Stole the Tarts, and then possibly Alice Gives Evidence, which is the last chapter. So this is going to be a 2-chapter video possibly. There is, as you can see, there is the Queen of Hearts, the White Rabbit, the King of Hearts, and the Knave of Hearts, who is being accused of stealing the tarts. Let's begin. The King and Queen of Hearts were seated on their throne when they arrived, with a great crowd assembled about them, all sorts of little birds and beasts, as well as the whole pack of cards. The Knave was standing before them in chains, a soldier on each side of him to guard him. The King was near the White Rabbit, with a trumpet in one hand, and a scroll of parchment in the other. In the middle of the court was a table, and upon it sat a large dish of tarts. They looked so good, they made Alice quite hungry to look at them. "I'd wish they'd get that trial done," she thought, and hand round the refreshment. But it seemed no chance of this, so she began looking at everything about her to pass the time. Alice had never been in a court of justice before, but she had read about them in books, and she was quite pleased to find she knew the name of nearly everything there. "That's the judge," she said to herself, because of his great wig. The judge, by the way, was the King, and he wore a crown over his wig, and he did not at all look comfortable, and certainly not becoming. And that's the jury, thought Alice, and those 12 creatures, she was obliged to say creatures, because, you see, some of them were animals and some of them were birds. "I suppose they are jurors," she said to this last word 2 or 3 times over to herself, being rather proud of it, for she thought, and rightly too, that very few little girls of her age knew the meaning of it. However, jurymen would have done just as well. 12 jurors were all busily writing on their slates. "What are they doing?" whispered Alice to the Griffin. "They can't have anything to put down yet, before the trial's begun." "They're putting down their names," said the Griffin, "for fear they should forget them before the end of the trial." "Stupid things," Alice began in a loud, indignant voice, but she stopped herself hastily, for the White Rabbit called out, "Silence in the court!" And the King put on his spectacles and looked anxiously around to make out who was talking. Alice could see, as well as though she were looking over their shoulders, that all the jurors were writing down stupid things on their slates, before she could even make out that one of them didn't know how to spell stupid, and that he had to ask his neighbor to tell him. "A nice muddle their slates will be in before the trial's over," thought Alice. One of the jurors had a pencil that squeaked. This, of course, Alice could not stand. She went around the court and got behind him, and very soon found the opportunity of taking it away. She did it so quickly that the poor little juror, for it was Bill the Lizard, could not make out at all what had become of it. So, after hunting about all over for it, he was obliged to write with one finger for the rest of the day. And that was of very little use, because it left no mark on the slate. "Harold, read the accusations," said the King. On this, the White Rabbit blew 3 blasts of his trumpet, and then unrolled the parchment scroll and read as follows: "The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all on a summer's day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts, and took them clean away." "Consider your verdict," the King said to the jury. Not yet," the Rabbit hastily interrupted. "There's a great deal to come before that." "I call the first witness," said the King, and the White Rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet and called out, "First witness!" The first witness was the Mad Hatter, and he came in with a teacup in hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other. "I beg your pardon, Majesty. he began, "for bringing these in, but I hadn't quite finished my tea when I was sent for." "You ought to have finished," said the king. "When did you begin?" The Hatter looked at the March Hare, who followed him into court, arm in arm with the Dormouse. "The 14th of March, I think it was," he said. "15th," said the Hare. "16th," added the Dormouse. "Write that down," said the king to the jury, and they all eagerly wrote down all 3 dates on their slates and added them up, and reduced the answer to shillings and pence. "Take off your hat," said the king to the Hatter. "It isn't mine," said the Hatter. "Stolen!" the king exclaimed, turned to the jury, who instantly made a memorandum of the fact. "I keep them to sell," said the Hatter, as an explanation. "I've none of my own. I'm a Hatter." Here the queen put on her spectacles and began staring hard at the Hatter, who turned pale and fidgeted. "Give your evidence, and don't be nervous, or I'll have you executed on the spot." This did not seem to encourage the witness, for he kept shifting about from one foot to the other, looking uneasily at the queen, and in his confusion he bit a large piece out of his teacup, instead of his bread and butter. And just that moment Alice felt a very curious sensation, which puzzled her for a good. And there is the Hatter and the queen. A good deal until she was able to make out what it was. She was beginning to grow larger again, and at first she thought she would have to get up and leave the court, but on second thought she decided to remain where she was, as long as there was room for her. "I wish you wouldn't squeeze so," said the Dormouse, who was sitting next to her. "I can hardly breathe." "I can't help it," said Alice very meekly. "I'm growing." "You've no right to grow here," said the Dormouse. "Don't talk nonsense," Alice said more boldly now. "I know you're growing too." "Yes, but I grow at a reasonable pace," said the Dormouse, "and not in this ridiculous fashion." And he got up very sulkily and crossed over to the other side of the court. All this time the queen had never left off staring at the Hatter, and just as the Dormouse crossed the court, she said to one of the officers, "Bring me the list of singers in the last concert," on which the wretched Hatter trembled so much that he shook in both his shoes. "Give your evidence," the king repeated angrily, "or I'll have you executed, whether you are nervous or not." "I'm a poor man, your majesty," the Hatter began in a trembling voice, "and I hadn't but just begun my tea, not above a week or so, and with that bread and butter getting so thin, and the twinkling of the tea—" "The twinkling of the what?" "It began with tea," replied Hatter. "Of course twinkling begins with a T," said the king sharply. "Do you take me for a dunce? Go on, man." "I'm a poor man," the Hatter went on, "and most things twinkled after that. Only the March Hare said—" "I didn't," said the March Hare, he interrupting in a great hurry. "You did," said the Hatter. "I deny it," said the Hare. "He denies it," said the king. Leave that part out." "Well, at any rate, the Dormouse said," the Hatter went on, looking anxiously around to see if he would be denied this too. "But the Dormouse denied nothing, being fast asleep. And after that I cut some more bread and butter. But what did the Dormouse say?" "I can't remember," said the Hatter. "You must remember, or I'll have you executed." The miserable Hatter dropped his teacup and bread and butter and went down on one knee. "I'm a poor man, your majesty," he began. "You're a very poor speaker," said the king. Here one of the guinea pigs cheered, and it was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court. As this is a rather hard word, I will explain to you just how it was done. They had a large canvas bag, which tied up at the mouth with strings, and into this they slipped the guinea pig head first, and then sat upon it. "I'm glad I've seen that done," thought Alice. "I've so often read in newspapers At the end of trials, there was some attempted applause, which was immediately suppressed by officers of the court, and I never really understood what it meant until now. If that's all you know, you may stand down. I can't go no lower, said the Hatter. I'm on the floor as it is. Then you may sit down, replied the king. Here another guinea pig cheered and was suppressed. Come, that finishes the guinea pigs, thought Alice. Now we shall get on better. I'd rather finish my tea, said the Hatter, with an anxious look at the Queen, who was leading the list of singers. You may go, said the king, and the Hatter hurriedly left the court without even waiting to put on his shoes. Just take his head off outside, the Queen added to one of the officers, but the Hatter was out of sight before the officer could get to the door. Call the next witness, said the king. The next witness was the Duchess's cook. She carried her pepper box in hand, and Alice guessed who it was before she even got to the court, by the way the people near the door began sneezing all at once. And here is the Duchess's cook and Alice in the courtroom. Give your evidence, said the king. I shan't, said the cook. The king looked anxiously at the White Rabbit, who said in a low voice, Your Majesty must cross-examine this witness. Yeah, well, if I must, said the king in a melancholy air, after folding his arms and frowning at the cook till his eyes were nearly out of sight. He said in a deep voice, What are tarts made of? Pepper, mostly, said the cook. Treacle, said a sleepy voice behind her. Collar that dormouse, the Queen shrieked. Behead the dormouse, turn the dormouse out of the court, suppress him, pinch him, off with his whiskers. And for some minutes the whole court was in a confusion, getting the poor dormouse turned out, and by the time they had settled down again, the cook had disappeared. Never mind, said the king, with an air of great relief. Call the next witness. And he added in an undertone to the Queen, Really, my dear, you must cross-examine the next witness. It quite makes my headache. Alice watched the White Rabbit as he fumbled over the list, feeling very curious to see what the next witness would be like. For they haven't got much evidence yet, she said to herself. And imagine her surprise when the White Rabbit read out at the top of his shrill little voice the name Alice! And there's Alice growing and hurriedly approaching the bench. And this is Alice Gives Evidence. Here, cried Alice, quite forgetting the flurry of the moment, how large she had grown in the last few minutes. She jumped up in such a great hurry that she tipped over the jury box with the edge of her skirt, upsetting all the jurymen onto the heads of the crowd below, and there they were, sprawling about, reminding her very much of a globe of goldfish she had once accidentally knocked the week before. Oh, I do beg your pardon, I really do, Alice exclaimed in a tone of great dismay, and began picking them up again as quickly as she could, for the accident of a goldfish kept running in her head, and she had a great vague sort of idea that they must be collected at once and put back in the jury's box, or they would die. This trial cannot proceed, said the king in a very grave voice, until the jurymen are back in their proper places, all, he repeated with great emphasis, looking hard at Alice as he said so. Alice looked at the jury box and saw that in her haste she had put the lizard in head downwards, and the poor little thing was waving its tail about in a melancholy sort of way, being quite unable to move. She soon got it out and put it right again. Not that it signifies much, she said to herself. I should think that it would be quite as much use in the trial one way up or as the other. As soon as the jury had recovered a little from its shock of being upset, and their slates and pencils had been found and handed back to them, they set to work very diligently to write out the history of the accident, all except the lizard, who seemed too much overcome to do anything but sit with its mouth open, gazing up into the roof of the court. What do you know of this business? The king said to Alice. Nothing, said Alice. Nothing whatever, persisted the king. Nothing whatever. That's very important, said the king, turning to the jury. and they began writing this down on their slate, when the White Rabbit interrupted. Unimportant, Your Majesty means, of course, he said in a very respectful tone, but frowning and making faces as he spoke. Unimportant, of course, I meant. Unimportant, 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 unimportant. Some of the juries wrote down important, and some of them wrote down unimportant. Alice could see this as she was near enough to look at the slates. But it doesn't matter a bit, she thought to herself. And at this moment the king, who had been for some time busily writing in his notebook, called out, "Silence!" and read out from his rule book. Rule 42. All persons more than a mile high must leave the court. Everybody looked at Alice. "I'm not a mile high," said Alice. "You are," said the king. "Nearly 2 miles high," said the queen. "I shan't go at any rate. And besides, that's not a regular rule. You invented it just now." "I know you did." "It's the oldest rule in the book," said the king. "Then it ought to be number 1, said Alice. The king turned pale and hastily shut his notebook. "Consider your verdict," he said to the jury in a low and trembling voice. "There's more evidence yet to come, please, Your Majesty," said the White Rabbit, jumping in a great hurry. This paper has just been picked up." "What is it? I haven't opened it yet," said the White Rabbit, "but it seems to be a letter, written by the prisoner to somebody." "It must have been that, unless it was written to nobody, which isn't usual, you know." "To whom is it directed?" said one of the jurymen. "It isn't directed at all," said the White Rabbit. "In fact, there's nothing written on the outside," he added, as he unfolded the paper and spoke. "It isn't a letter after all, it's a set of verses." "Are they in the prisoner's handwriting?" asked another of the jurymen. "No, they're not. And the queerest thing about it is, and that's the queerest thing about it." All the jury looked puzzled. "He must have imitated someone else's hand," said the king. All the jurors brightened up again. "Please, Your Majesty," the knave, "I didn't write it, and they can't prove I did. There's no name signed at the end. If you didn't sign it, that only makes matters worse. You must have meant some mischief, or you'd sign your name like an honest man." There was a general clapping of hands at this, and it was really the first clever thing the king had said all day. "This proves his guilt," said the queen. "It proves nothing of the sort," said Alice. Why, you don't even know what they're about. Read them." The White Rabbit put on his spectacles. "Where shall I begin, Your Majesty?" he asked. "At the beginning, of course," the king said gravely, "and you will go on until you come to the end and stop." These were the verses the White Rabbit read. "They told me you had been to her, and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim. He sent them word that I had not gone, for we know it to be true. If she pushed the matter on, what would become of you? I gave her 1, they gave him 2. You gave us 3 or more. They all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts you to set them free exactly where we were. But my notion was that you had been, before she had this fit, an obstacle that come between himself and ourselves and it. Don't let him know she liked them best, for this must ever be a secret kept from all the rest, between yourself and me." "That is the most important piece of evidence we have heard yet," said the king, rubbing his hands. "Now let the jury, if anyone can explain them," said Alice, for she had grown so large in the last few minutes that she wasn't a bit afraid of interrupting. "I'll give them 6 pence. I don't know that there's an atom of meaning in it." The jury all wrote that down in the slates. "She doesn't believe there's an atom of meaning in it." But none of them attempted to explain the paper. "If there is no meaning in it," said the king, then that saves us a world of trouble. As you know, we needn't try to find any." And yet I don't know, he went on, spreading out the verses on his knee and looking at them with one eye. I seem to see something in the meaning after all. Said I could not swim. You can't swim, can you? He added, turning to the knave. The knave shook his head sadly. Do I look like it? He said, which he certainly did not, being made entirely of cardboard. All right, so far, said the king, and then he went on, muttering over the verses to himself. We know it to be true, that's the jury, of course. I gave her one, they gave him two. Why, that must be what you did with the tarts, you know. But it goes on. They had all returned from him to you, said Alice. Why, there they are. Nothing can be clearer than that. And then again, before she had this fit. You never have fits, my dear, I think, he said to the queen. Never, said the queen furiously, throwing the inkstand at the lizard as she spoke. The unfortunate little Bill had left off writing. Another motorcycle. Forgive the interruptions, readers. Unfortunate little Bill had left off writing on his slate with his finger, as he found it made no mark. But now he hastily began again, using the ink, which was trickling down his face, as long as it lasted. Then the words don't fit you, said the king. And there was as he smiled round, looking at the court, there was a dead silence. It's a pun, the king added in an angry tone. Everybody laughed. Let the jury consider their verdict, said the king, for about the 20th time that day. No, no, said the queen. Sentence first, verdict afterwards. Stuff and nonsense, Alice said loudly. The idea of having the sentence first. Hold your tongue, said the queen, turning purple. I won't, said Alice. Off with her head, shouted the queen at the top of her voice. Nobody moved. Who cares for you, said Alice, for she had grown to her full size by this time. Why, you're nothing but a pack of playing cards. At this, the whole pack rose up into the air and came flying down at her. She gave a little scream, half of fright and half of anger, and tried to beat them off, and found herself laying on the bank with her head in the lap of her sister, who was gently brushing away some dead leaves that had fluttered down from the trees upon her face. Wake up, Alice, wake up, dear, she said to her sister. Why, you've had such a long sleep. Oh, I've had such a curious dream, said Alice, and she told her sister, as well as she could remember them. I'm going to let that go by. As well as she could remember them, all the strange adventures of hers that you have just been reading about. And when she was finished, her sister kissed her forehead and said, It was a curious dream, my dear, certainly, but now run into your tea. It's getting late. And so Alice got up and ran off, and while she ran, as well she might, she thought of the wonderful dream it had been. And there is Alice running from the cards. But her sister sat still just as she left her, leaning her head on her hand and watching the sunset, and thinking of little Alice and all her wonderful adventures, till she too began daydreaming after a fashion. And this was her dream. First she dreamed a little of Alice herself. Once again the tiny hands were clasped upon her knee, her bright eager eyes looking up into hers, and she could hear the very tones of her voice, and see that queer little toss of her head, and keep back her wandering hair that would always get into her eyes. And still as she listened, or seemed to listen, the whole place around her became alive with the strange creatures from her sister's dreams. The long grass rustled at her feet as the white rabbit hurried by. The frightened mouse splashed his way through the neighboring pool. She could hear the rattle of teacups as the March Hare and his friends shared their never-ending meal, and the shrill voice of the queen ordering off her unfortunate guests to execution. Once more the baby the baby pig, the baby pig seizing on the Duchess's knee, while plates and dishes smashed around it. Once more the shriek of the griffin, the squeak of the lizard's pencil slate, the lizard's slate pencil, and the choking of the suppressed guinea pigs filled the air, mixed up with the distant sob of the miserable mock turtle. And so she sat on, and with her eyes closed, she half believed herself in Wonderland. And though she had but to open them again, and all would change to dull reality. The grass would only be rustling in the wind, and the pool rippling to the waves of reeds, and the rattling teacups would change to tinkling sheep bells, and the queen's shrill cries would be that of the shepherd boy, and the sneeze of the baby, and the shriek of the griffin, and all the other queer noises would change to the confusion of the clamor of a busy farmyard, while the lowing of the cattle in the distance would take the place of the mock turtle's heavy sobs. And lastly, she pictured to herself how this same little sister of hers would, in the aftertime, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep, through all her riper years, the simple and loving heart of a childhood, and how she would gather about her children, and make their eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale, and perhaps the dream of Wonderland so long ago, and how she would feel with all their simple sorrows and joys, and thus remembering her own childhood and happy summer days. And that is the end of Alice's adventures in Wonderland. We shall start through the looking glass and what Alice found there next week. See you, readers. Bye.